Back in March, I reviewed Ace Combat. Released in 1995, it was the first combat flight simulator released on console by Namco, and it showcased some pretty interesting gameplay for the time, in spite of presentation that was slightly behind the times, especially against its arcade counterparts. Over the 2 years that followed, the development team would look at how they could improve what they already had. What resulted was 1997's Ace Combat 2. Despite not selling as many units, it was a massive improvement in every aspect, and even where certain bits of those aspects were weaker, the end result was ultimately better in the end. Where could Namco go from there though? I like what Ace Combat 2 did a lot, but the problem here is it felt like the natural end of a concept. 2 straight-laced flight sims on the trot is fine if the second is a significant step up, which thankfully is the case. But going down that same road for the third game in a row is a quick way to burn you out. Basically, the task that Namco had on their hands was to make a game that could improve on Ace Combat 2, by giving the next game things that weren't in place before. For example, a focus on story with branching paths, a whole new presentation direction, more mechanical complexity. The sky's the limit, really. Ultimately, in 1999, the Ace Combat series would take a sharp turn left. The third entry represented a massive change in direction for the series, and whilst it's still familiar territory, it won't let you get too comfortable. For one final time, in this triple header, let's take to the skies, in Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere. Where Ace Combat 2's core development ideology was evolution, the core development ideology for Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere was revolution. It just wasn't enough to be more of the same but better. The game needed a total shift in direction. With that, you get massive changes in how the game looks, sounds, and plays. The game doesn't shy away from being very different in its looks in particular, where before it kept things looking contemporary and militaristic, it would become very sci-fi forward, complete with an anime aesthetic that brings the whole thing together. The game also features a greater focus on story compared to before. The first game's mostly linear campaign and the second game's occasional fork and merge are now replaced by a campaign that has major decisions in them that affect how you progress and interact with things in the world. We got all of these changes, but did it amount to much? In sales terms, it was only a slight improvement over Ace Combat 2, selling 1,164,000 units, edging out the prior entry by little over 70,000 units. Given the scope and ambition, it's a bit disappointing. Critically, however, it reviewed well. The original Japanese release reviewed very well in the press, noting that the branching story enabled it to be more engaging for longer, and the bump up in realism helped the game to look and feel all the more spectacular in the end. Concerningly, however, the Western release was a lot more harshly received. Whilst it had some publications proclaiming its virtues, it was received much more coldly compared to the Japanese release on the whole. Can't imagine why. Anyway, it's about time that we started taking a look at this game, and trust me, there is a lot that we need to look at, so let us begin with taking a look at the packaging and its contents. Comparing the cover arts over the years is an interesting exercise. 1995's Ace Combat, featuring a rather simple arcade facade style of packaging, later became 1997's Ace Combat 2, complete with its cleaner, more designed artwork. Both of these would give way to 1999's Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, whose cover art takes after Ace Combat 2 in a few areas, but stripped down even further. The line art is replaced by a render of a Sukhoi Su-37, and very limited imagery confined mostly to the top and bottom of the box art itself. The logo too is much simpler compared to the original Ace Combat logo, consisting of sci-fi style typography, without the phoenix icon to go with it compared to prior entries. All of this is overlaid atop a series of faint lines. I also like the little touch at the bottom where everything lines up with the PlayStation logo. That's neat. In any case, it's a fairly striking cover art. If I compared Ace Combat 2's cover art to Wipeout, I can compare Electrosphere's cover art to Wipeout 3, whose Japanese cover makes use of clean imagery and design that catches the eye. Visual clarity is an important aspect of graphic design, and Electrosphere handles it well. The back of the box is a fair bit busier with a lot of images on the back. There is a lot going on here, and impressively, it actually works quite well. While some of the images are hard to make out, they tend to give a good idea of what's in the game. Ordinarily, I tend to say that images should be fairly large for legibility, but here it seems to do a good enough job at the size the images are at. No huge complaints here, however. Before we look too deeply at the images though, let's look at what's in the box. The answer is a lot of paper, but also there are 2 discs, a lot of content within. Looking at the printed stuff first, we have the prerequisite survey card, but we also have 2 booklets, the first being the manual. It's a very clean manual with everything laid out in a pretty straightforward way that's easy to follow. Things are generally given a lot of space to breathe, and it avoids the issue of bunching quite nicely. The manual also introduces you to a few new concepts that the game offers up, assuming you can read what is written here. The main thing I want to get to in this section is the Photosphere. It's an added booklet that comes with the game and provides you with not just some nice pictures to look at, but also some background information on the characters and some aircraft. What's especially cool is that it's bilingual. There is both English and Japanese text in this. It's generally in small print, but if that's not a problem for you, there's a lot of stuff you can glean from this. Fair warning, however, this is about the last of the English text you'll be seeing here. So for one final time, let's get this show on the road and headed right for the skies. Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere is go. Starting up Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, we are given the usual Namco logo stuff that we can barely see because of the changing resolutions. Yes, more of that stuff later, because we're then thrown into a start screen. Huh, that's different. Wait a few seconds, however, and we get an opening cutscene animated by the masters over at Production IG, who I'll talk about more in due course. This cutscene looks really good, but the stylistic changes between 2 and 3 are very apparent here. In any case, we'd better get on with starting the game up. The process of starting a new game is a little longer here, since it involves starting up a new account, running through a few sound and video settings, but we begin the game eventually. The game starts out with a video sequence starting up a program, before we're thrust right into a sort of information tube. Once we're in, we're being given a ton of information about the setting the game takes place in. It starts off with a news report about a potentially troubling military situation, before it gets cut off with a commercial featuring some very odd-looking aircraft, all from a corporation called Neucom.
Power for life, Neucom.
Not to be outdone, another commercial by a company called General Resource proclaims its virtues and how life is great and wonderful, and wait, is this starting to sound like a cheesy life insurance commercial? General Resource then doubles down on this, providing information on an ace pilot for another organisation, UPEO, as well as mentioning her having a condition with her skin that requires her to wear a specialised suit to survive exposure to the sun. Neucom returns, talking about their research and development streak over the years, explaining how Neucom had started out with a splinter group of General Resource engineers, before we suddenly get a recording of a candid one-on-one interview with the pilot mentioned a moment ago, Rena Hirose. It seems that this world really does tend to look at pilots almost as celebrities or something. It is quite the interesting setting, but it front-loads everything on top of you so suddenly. If you've played Half-Life, this will feel somewhat familiar. After about 4 minutes of being slapped across the face repeatedly with lore and background information, we get a call from Eric, a fellow UPEO pilot, warning us to not disobey Commander Park and making sure he's got his back covered, yada yada. Shortly after that, Fiona pops in to confirm all UPEO personnel are to be placed on indefinite standby, essentially meaning that we'll be called upon at any moment to take to the skies in the event of a situation frothing over. The timing couldn't be more impeccable, as moments later an emergency news broadcast comes up, announcing to us that the war of words between General Resource and Neucom has escalated to a war of actual weapons. Time to make a move then. We get a menu now, after almost 6 minutes of watching things happening in the world around us, and we can use it as an opportunity to check the settings or go through some information if we want. But for now, let's head over to the briefing screen, see what we have to do, and pick our craft. Don't worry about the weapons for now. So what to start out with here? I could start out with the presentation, but I'll stick with talking about the gameplay first for now. To put it simply, the gameplay here carries many of the innovations brought in through Ace Combat 2, but introduces a few new changes that alter the experience a little bit. Firstly, let's go through the controls. The control scheme in Ace Combat 2 is largely carried over into Electrosphere, with the expert control scheme being the default now, but this time out you get a few slight changes to responsiveness. I'll touch on this more when we get to the physics this game employs. For now though, let me make mention of an interesting change to the controls. The right analog stick can now be used to look around you in flight, so you can get your bearings, try to spot targets, and so on. For a similar purpose, you can press the triangle button by default to change the lock on target, but if you want to focus on your current target, hold that same button down and the camera will focus on it, leaving it up to you to maneuver towards it. In general though, the controls haven't changed in a dramatic way. If you have a Negicon, an analog joystick, a dual analog controller, or a DualShock, you'll be well catered for in Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, just as you were in Ace Combat 2. So about the physics of flight. Things are a bit different here by dint of this game making use of a modestly futuristic setting, so the technological advances on display in the game's story will probably account for how different new planes and the like will fly. The changes to the physics are mostly refinements to those in the previous entry. Here, aircraft feel a bit weightier compared to before. That's not to say they felt like paper in Ace Combat 2, but in Electrosphere, they actually lose altitude if you go slow enough. On that note, stalling. In past games, stalling your aircraft, by flying too high an altitude at too low a speed for example, would immediately cause your craft to dive, forcing you to wait until it's corrected itself to get back under control. Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere does things a little different. Here, aircraft stall under similar circumstances to how they did before, but they'll do so without sending you into an immediate dive. Instead, you'll slowly and progressively dive. Your craft begins to feel like you're swimming in a sea of marmalade before you get it back under control, as opposed to feeling like it's recoiling from something it's seen on the internet, like the result of being told to look up a 6-digit number. It's a poor choice of word, but Electrosphere's flight physics feel more grounded in the real world than they did in prior games. I don't want to say realistic, because I think that's a bit too extreme of a claim for me to make, but they certainly feel like what you would get from something purporting to be realistic in the late 1990s. The alterations to physics also allow a few different things to work better. For instance, maneuvers like loops are much easier to perform compared to before, and you don't end up getting confused about what's going on like you could in prior entries. A couple quirks about this game's physics become apparent when you have collisions. In prior games, any sort of collision with the terrain or buildings is a definite game over. Now, depending on the speed, attack angle and so on, you might survive it, albeit with a substantial amount of damage. This is why I don't want to say realistic with regards to the game's flight physics, since, well, I don't expect it's particularly realistic to hit the ground and still be capable of flight. I'm not an expert in aviation though, so I can't confirm either way. Now to get into what exactly it is you do in this game. So much like the previous two entries, you have a series of missions to complete with different objectives, environments and targets in each, and you beat the game by completing these missions successfully in sequence. The problem with saying this is that it ignores what this game does to innovate on what the previous entries did. This is where the revolution instead of evolution thing comes into play for Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere. Without going into spoilers, since we are nowhere near ready to get into the weeds of the larger story yet, we have multiple endings available to us like the previous entry. However, instead of 2 endings depending on what you do in one mission, you now have 5 endings which changes depending on your actions in at least 2 missions. Your actions will put you onto very different paths, and you'll be put into situations that give you a difficult question to answer. To whom do you pledge allegiance in these situations? Who do you trust at that moment? No matter the loyalty, whichever way you go, the progression has changed in a substantial way, making referring to progression in prior games irrelevant. You don't earn money in missions to buy aircraft, as they are unlocked by progressing the story. The different kinds of aircraft you get as you progress vary depending on which storyline you follow. Where General Resource tend to use more traditional designs, Neucom will have much more futuristic designs that look more like fish than planes, with UPEO having a mix of the two. As you unlock new aircraft, you'll also unlock new stuff to use with these craft. Instead of just guns and missiles, you get to choose which flavours of guns and missiles you would like on your craft. You also don't have to worry too much about the missiles that you have, because you can still use them as regular old missiles against craft, even if you pick the missile type that's designed to be used as an air-to-ground bomb. It's quite a nice feature that cuts down on worrying about optimising your loadout. And now for the missions that you partake in during this campaign. Much like the previous entry, they come in many forms, including bombing runs, defensive sorties, and even the odd reconnaissance mission. The actual mission variety hasn't gone up a tremendous amount compared to Ace Combat 2, but Electrosphere does make good on a few of the things Ace Combat 2 introduced, but didn't take complete advantage of. For example, in Ace Combat 2 you got one mission in which you flew above cloud level. In Electrosphere, you get a handful of them, including a mission where you're sent into the stratosphere in a Blackbird. And that's just one example of the variety on offer where missions are concerned. There are even a few missions that take place from different perspectives depending on where your loyalties lie. It's a game that does a good job of making the different campaigns feel worthwhile in the end, and I will avoid going into too many more details for now, lest I start spoiling things. On top of all this, missions can have a great deal of things going on during them, in the sense that objectives can change as the mission goes on, making missions feel more like active, evolving encounters rather than one-and-done situations like prior entries could sometimes fall into the trap of doing. The problem with this though is that you can sometimes feel a bit overloaded with the objectives you have, to a point where you may just end up going straight for the objectives and not bother with the secondary stuff surrounding you. And you can do that if you want, so long as you don't mind the potentially lower mission grading. On that note, you'll get grades after the completion of a mission, in which you'll be given a grade from D at the worst, indicating a failure to complete all objectives but doing enough to pass the mission, to A at the best, generally indicating you completed objectives in good time and with a number of optional targets eliminated. By and large, it won't make a massive difference, but if you want to keep track of your progress in terms of ranking, the start screen has a readout of all of the missions you've completed so far. It doesn't tell you which ones exactly, but it looks pretty, which is a great segue to talking about the presentation. When it comes to graphics in Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, there is a lot going on here. There are games that go for a blend of anime aesthetics with a grounded semi-realistic presentation, and for a game on the PlayStation, Electrosphere does a pretty good job of striking a balance. To begin with, let's start off with the anime side of things. The studio that was brought in to work on this was Production IG, and if you're a connoisseur of 1990s animation from Japan, they're doubtless a name you're familiar with. They are also no strangers to working with Namco, having handled the 3D CG work for Tekken 3, as well as working on all manner of games from the likes of Sega for the Sakura Wars series, having started in 1998 with Sakura Wars 2, Thou Shalt Not Die. Throughout the game, anime cutscenes are sprinkled lovingly around, with a substantial amount of the game's story being fed to you via these cutscenes located within the Electrosphere itself. Yeah, that's what this Johnny Mnemonic information tube is, don't worry about it. You'll also get talking heads appearing during messages, where an economical approach to animation is taken, as portraits are basically a bunch of sprites. Makes sense really, since you don't need amazingly detailed animation for this sort of thing. The amount of video in this game results in Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere having 2 discs to accommodate everything. It is quite the big game, and it makes pretty good use of the video accompaniments. Now to talk about other aspects of the visuals, starting with the technical stuff. Yet again, it's a mix of 240p and 480i, although in this case the 480i is a tad more justifiable thanks to the animation and more dense text. But the changes are still there. At least the resolution change takes place when not much of anything is going on. It also has another annoying issue, somewhat like the problem Gran Turismo had, where a row of pixels in 240p mode are snipped off from the top or bottom. It's a weird issue that, annoying as it is, doesn't have a massive effect on the game, thankfully. Things do improve when you consider how smooth the game plays in concert with how good everything looks. The PlayStation was a well-understood machine in 1999, and the graphical improvements this game makes use of are not to be ignored. Keep in mind, this game plays at a very consistent 30 frames per second. I did not encounter any particularly notable hitches during my time playing this game, and I am astounded given just how good this game looks for the console. Set the controls for the heart of the sun and you're going to get momentarily blinded. Get sent to the stratosphere and the skies will lose their blue hue the further away from the Earth you go. The range of colours it manages to render in mission are thanks in no small part to the considerable amount of dithering the game makes use of. You can see it in effects with the horizon, and the effect works especially well on CRTs, so you can imagine this game looking simply incredible on an older TV. The aircraft themselves look fantastic as well. The detail on display is great and you get some frankly amazing replay footage after a mission is complete. Genuinely, this is one of my favourite things in this game, seeing the action outside of the cockpit after it's all unfurled. It looks fantastic. You can even play about with it using the controls. Other details that show themselves include some particle effects. Not just explosions either, but also from the more fantastical craft this game has. It's like a load of glitter has been jettisoned from craft which look like boomerangs? Yeah, sure, okay. The design of the fictional aircraft can border on insane even. The Night Raven, a massive plane in its own right, looks like a science fiction take on a biplane, as do a whole bunch of other craft. Others look more like organic beings, which makes things look quite unique and unusual. It also does a cool job of adapting existing aircraft into its setting by swapping out the old canopies they once had to have something akin to a series of screens within the cockpit, hence the ability to look around unobstructed. If you've seen a mecha anime like Gundam or Evangelion, you'll be instantly familiar with the idea. However, some things linger eternal, as you have the same issue as with the other games of the UI being basically unreadable over certain colours. It can get quite annoying at times. During missions though, the UI itself looks especially unique for what it is. The artificial horizon, basically being in 3D space within the cockpit, is probably the most user-friendly concept I've seen so far. Airspeed and altitude just being numbers and not bars is a tad disappointing, but it is what it is. And perhaps the best thing about the general aesthetic of this game? It doesn't go overboard with the sci-fi concepts for the most part. There are things that I'll touch on later that do verge on absolute batshit, but for now, the restraint shown is impressive. Pretty much the most insane thing I can really talk about is the concept of the Electrosphere itself. But even then, it's not so out there, given we have things like virtual reality, the metaverse, and all of that. Stuff like this was hot topic in the 1990s, with shows like Serial Experiments Lane touching on this information superhighway idea. I'm making a lot of references to anime here, so I think I may be best off moving on to another topic. So, having covered much of the visuals, I'm going to move on to talking about the sound now. Let's begin with the general sound design. The first Ace Combat played it straight with its sound design, whereas Ace Combat 2 refined it in ways that worked really well. Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere continues this trend by sounding cleaner overall. The most notable change to me is to the lock-on sound. When you're close enough to a target to get missile lock, in prior games you tended to hear a long droning noise. Now it's a gentle blip 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 sound. Other sounds like explosions, gunfire, jet noise and other stuff feel like they've been cleaned up and made a bit punchier. Really, the sound effects themselves are a case of evolution more than revolution here, but the introduction of more overt sci-fi elements does provide a few other sounds you wouldn't have encountered before in other games. Ultimately, the biggest changes to the game's sound come from the soundtrack and the voice acting. I'll cover the soundtrack first since it's a big departure from prior entries and warrants a pretty close inspection. The previous entries had mostly guitar-driven rock music for their soundtracks, although it could dive into different genres if it wanted to, with hints of jazz, ambient music and electronic music. They were both really good soundtracks in all, but this is 1999 and everyone's listening to Hikaru Utada now, so what better way to be in keeping with the late 1990s than with an electronic soundtrack? Not a bad idea given they've already dabbled with the genre in Ace Combat 2. In execution, it is such a good soundtrack. It's pretty impressive how flexible electronic music can really be, and the game benefits a great deal from track selection in the different parts of the game. It's so good. The sound work was directed mostly by Tetsukazu Nakanishi, with work from Koji Nakagawa, Kanako Kakino, Hiroshi Okubo, Go Shiina, Tomoko Tatsuta, and Asuka Sakai also featuring. The music used in the introduction is a very good representation of what to expect in general, with the upbeat, almost Discovery-like sound to it for the first half, before it breaks into something more emergent and dynamic for the second half. The music you hear in your first mission, Transparent Blue, has an almost glassy, crystalline quality to it, with how it makes use of echo and reverb, whereas tracks like Physical Layer have more of an aggressive tone to them that reminds me somewhat of The Prodigy, if somewhat superficially. You also get slightly more ominous tracks like The Protocol, which would resemble a classic drum and bass track if not for the sweeping waves that start the track up and continue throughout. There's also Mind Flow, which starts out ethereal and very quiet, before ramping up after about 45 seconds. And then you get a track like The Maneuver, which is as urgent as you get with this soundtrack. It's a menacing, angry track that demands your attention. Black Lotus is similar, but it's more sinister than it is in your face. And Lithium is supremely sinister sounding. I love it. But then Frozen Soul shows up, sounding like you're floating in the clouds, all comfy-like. It's a complete 180 to a track like The Maneuver, in pretty much every way besides quality, because it is still an excellent track. The different moods this soundtrack conveys in concert with the variety of musical effects on offer with it all, makes this a genuinely fantastic soundtrack. I love this and would have no hesitation in listening to this out of context. It is fantastic, and clearly Namco agree since you can buy it as a CD. And now for the rest of the sound stuff, I'm going to focus on the voice acting. Generally speaking, I'm not good at discussing Japanese voice acting since it is not the language I am fluent in, but what I can say is it does a good job of conveying dialogue. This probably goes hand in hand with the writing in this game, since some of the cutscenes showcase an interesting dynamic between the world in which the game takes place and the people within it. The thing I think about immediately is the news anchor who corrects himself mid-sentence to soften the language he uses to refer to a particular company, changing "what are they demanding" to "what are they expecting." It's an interesting detail that did not go unnoticed. As for the characters you're in close contact with, their speech patterns give off their ideas quite well, and what to expect of them as characters. Rena, who is voiced by Yuri Shiratori, comes across as reserved and philosophical, or serious and even cold when the situation calls for it. You'll hear other characters like Keith, voiced by Daiki Nakamura, someone who likes to be the top dog, whilst also caring a great deal for his comrades, almost to a point of fearing not having them anymore. The characters here have a lot going on, and it would be very difficult for me to talk about them in much of a capacity without diving into spoiler territory. So with all of that said, the general sound design in this game is fantastic. But if ever there was a time to talk about a massive problem with this game, it would be about now, especially after covering the stuff regarding the voice acting. So let us discuss the localization that Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere got. By and large, Namco's games of the PlayStation era tended to be progressively more complex as time went on, featuring branching stories and novel gameplay concepts, but nearing the turn of the millennium, Namco were in serious financial trouble. The downturn in sales coincided with the recession Japan suffered at the time. After the prosperity of the 1980s, the 1990s brought on reduced spending, asset price crashes, and poor economic growth at the time compared to other industrialized nations. Whilst Namco was still operating throughout these difficult times, releasing successful titles such as Tekken 3 and Soul Calibur, they were treading water in those economically turbulent days. Let's just say they took some conservative decisions. When Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere released, it was a marked departure for the series, in no small part due to its focus on branching storylines, but also because it was the first game in the series to feature minimal English, allowing the developers to focus on a game that works for its home audience. This did mean, however, that localizing the game would be a longer and much more expensive endeavour than before. For comparison, Ace Combat 2 was pretty much entirely in English, so localizing the game would have been a relatively simple process. Eventually, Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere would see Western shores, firstly hitting Europe in January 2000, with the US release arriving in March that same year. And whilst it received some praise from Western audiences, there was a feeling of something is missing throughout the praise. To put it simply, the complex branching story, the production IG animated cutscenes that helped to tell the story, the voice acting that tied everything together, all delivered on 2 discs? Every single aspect of that had been cut from the Western releases. The game that the West saw was a gutted and taxidermied Frankenstein, everything linked together by hopes, dreams, and blue tack. A third of the missions had been cut from the game, effectively meaning you're getting 2/3 of the gameplay of the Japanese original, with a story so thin you'd think it was a slice of ham in a service station sandwich. It was a baffling and perhaps cynical decision from Namco to release Electrosphere in the West in that state. Agnes Kaku, who worked as a translator at Namco and Konami for a time, had worked on a demo localization, but ultimately, the game did not get the full localization treatment it deserved, according to Kaku, due to financial reasons. She had written an article titled "How to Not Save Money," detailing the problem, but I can't seem to find it. Kazutoki Kono, who worked on many a game over the years with Namco, including those in the Ace Combat series, also stated that the team wasn't big enough at the time to be able to deliver such a localization effort. The amount of work that would have to be carried out was too big for the team to take on, and because of that, the decision was made to just make more Ace Combat games, instead of adapting the ones that already existed for other audiences. Because of this, Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere never got the release it deserved in the West, and likely never will. What should have been an ambitious and impressive feat of game design turned into a shooting gallery with a vague sci-fi aesthetic, cosplaying as the actual Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere. Out of frustration, a fan translation project had formed roughly a decade after the game's Japanese release, called Project Nemo. They tore open the game's files, looked at what could be translated, and did everything in their efforts to make the game playable for English-speaking audiences without issue. Well, without issue in a relative sense, because there are a few things of note with this translation. Firstly, there are documented issues that can result in the game freezing if you go into certain menus or look up certain articles in the search function through the data swallow. Also, it's not a completed translation. A great deal of the articles in the data swallow are not translated, neither are some of the menus, and there are a number of situations where dialogue plays in-game, but with no captions. This last one isn't unique to the translation though, some things just don't have captions in the original. The other issue I had with trying to get this to work is I couldn't apply the patch properly to disk images that I had created myself due to checksum conflicts. So I turned to pre-patched images and burnt them onto what few blank CDs I had left. My PlayStation has a mod chip that makes this playable, thankfully. Whilst this isn't a completed translation, and whilst there are issues with glitches in places, this is still a sufficiently good means of playing through the game if you don't want to deal with the Japanese original. The text is reasonably legible, though I would prefer if text in the data swallow used a different typeface, as this impact style typeface is tricky to read at that resolution. It isn't a typeface designed for that purpose, and the in-game and in-cutscene captions use a different typeface that's more readable. But yes, despite the issues it has, it's still a perfectly acceptable way of playing the game, and even if it's not finished, with little sign that it will be finished, it does at least have an order of magnitude more effort put into it than what Namco did, if ever there was a more damning indictment on how this game has been treated. That being said, I think it would be a good use of time to talk about the game's playability from the perspective of someone who doesn't have the best grasp on Japanese. I know I've been doing this for over 3 years and I'm still an idiot with the language. The first Ace Combat game didn't have a ton of Japanese in it that you would be required to understand, though there were some things that would definitely have been beneficial for the best experience. Ace Combat 2 streamlines things for a Western audience a lot better by having the entire game playable in English. Japanese is only really reserved as a translation medium for its native audience, weird as that may sound. Compared to the first two Ace Combat games, Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere is a bit of an anomaly. The focus on story makes it so that little useful English is present in the game at all. This is a game explicitly designed for a Japanese audience, and it shows. If you are unfamiliar with Japanese and you're okay with not understanding the story in this game or what you're actually doing, then you can get along fine with it by taking it as a fun little action game. However, if you want to actually understand things, you are going to have a time of it. If you insist on playing the Japanese version because you don't want to deal with the patched copy for whatever reason, and your Japanese isn't the best, then do yourself a favour and use transcripts for the different things in the game. It will make the game all the more digestible for you, and while they're not perfectly and exactly accurate, they do a good enough job of explaining what is going on, what is being said, and makes a game that is about as accessible as a locked door, much more accessible by providing you with a key. This now leaves us with just the story to talk about now. You know, the thing Namco shafted the West out of having. I did make a few mentions to the story already, but before discussing it in detail, I'll talk about some details that surround the game. I mentioned that this game has 5 endings earlier on, and boy does it make use of them. The different paths tend to show similar events, but the perspective changes give them a unique flavour, and a chance to consider what is going on in other viewpoints. The different paths you can take are a signal to you in fairly obvious ways. Betray the people you know to follow a new cause, or stick to what you know and stay with the plan. It's up to you. The different perspectives can also open up slight forks in the road, after certain objectives are left incomplete, leaving you to tackle a different mission to potentially rectify that. And now I want to talk about the story itself. Canonically, this game takes place in what is presently the end of the timeline in the series, despite it being the first game to dive into the setting it presents, since Ace Combat 2 was retroactively put into the canon. This time, however, instead of a coup d'etat from a terrorist group trying to depose the current governing forces, here you have major corporations engaging in hostilities that put the lives of millions of people at risk. The game takes place in 2040 in an event known as the Intercorporate War, the belligerents being General Resource and Neucom. We've seen these two airing a few commercials at the start of the game and whatnot, so let's explain who they are real quick. General Resource is an organisation with what can be described as monopolistic power in virtually every aspect of life. You could consume media published and broadcast by General, eat and drink General manufactured foods and drinks, live or work in buildings built by General, and so on. Neucom grew rapidly in terms of technological and scientific development, and General Resource started to see them as a threat, especially with Neucom hiring General staff in the decade leading into the eventual war that would come about. Stuck in the middle of all this is the Universal Peace Enforcement Organization, or UPEO for short. Operating as a peacekeeping organisation under the wing of the Neo-United Nations, or NUN, their role is to try and keep the tensions between General and Neucom from reaching full-scale conflict. Enter SARF, UPEO's Special Armed Response Force. You, as Nemo by default, are recruited to pilot a selection of craft in an attempt to keep the peace, but as the game progresses, things get increasingly problematic. From this point forward, however, I am going into the specific beats of every single campaign in this. This is going to take a while, so I'll leave chapter marks where appropriate. Otherwise, if you want to avoid spoilers for every single part of this game's story, Skip to the conclusion chapters. To start off with, let's take the UPEO route. It's the standard route of the game to play. You start off completing a couple sorties with Sarf, before you encounter a couple folks from General who want to test you on your ability with piloting these big sculpted hunks of metal. I'm sure there's no ulterior motive here or anything. Among them is an individual called Abyssal Dijon, our latest entrant, after 3.5 years, to the cool but not really list of goofy names. Damn, I've really missed this list. Anyway, he tells you that you've got some potential as a pilot, and that you should join General instead of sticking it out with Sarf. It's at this point in the game, during the mission Paper Tiger, that you are required to make a decision. Follow Dijon to General, or stick with Fiona and the crew at UPEO. You decide that Dijon asking you to come over to his house before you've even gotten to know him is a bit creepy, so you decide to stick with UPEO and promptly land. In the meantime, your crewmate Rena was out due to a maintenance issue on her suit to protect her from UV rays. A canyon mission to find a General spy plane follows shortly after, and Rena has some memories of this place, it would seem. She talks to herself about this canyon, and we're tuned in the whole time. Anyhow, depending on how the above mission Ghosts of the Past turned out, the next few missions will involve you either flying out without clearance but managing to save the day, or trying to prevent an airship carrying a biological weapon from crashing into any of the buildings around the place and dispersing it. Eventually though, we make our way to the next mission of importance in this playthrough, Scylla and Charybdis. Oh hey, I've read the Odyssey. In this, we escort the UPEO delegate G.W. Clarkson over towards Cape Rainy, whilst preventing the passenger craft he is in from being assaulted. However, a call from command comes in after the mission is complete, leaving you with another choice to make. You are told that Delegate Clarkson is a traitor who is in the process of defecting to Neucom, and your command is to shoot the vessel down, and if you don't, Rena will do it instead. The decision also comes with an additional problem. Delegate Clarkson isn't the only one on board. So is Fiona, one of Sarf's pilots. However, to continue the UPEO route, it is a bird that must be struck down, even if it's not by you. This was probably the hardest decision in the game for me to make, because I'm usually a goody two-shoes when it comes to morality mechanics in games, but I tend to avoid bloodshed in these kinds of situations where possible. For this to continue, however, you simply can't avoid it. As a result, once the personal plane is shot down, you have to refuel in flight and make your way over to White Valley to prepare for more conflicts between General and Neucom. And now that the man in charge of trying to keep the peace is no longer here to do so, the escalation in hostilities is only inevitable. Soon after, reaching for stars is a mission that involves you destroying General's antlions, which are trying to prevent the launch of a Neucom craft that's heading for space. Before we get a mission that's unusual for this series, a high-speed chase with a train that has a top-secret unit on board and must be recovered. And then comes Bug Hunt. Your objective is to bomb hives of nanobite clusters in the ground so as to reduce their growth. The nanobites left unchecked have resulted in large mesa-like formations that will damage you if you're near them, and you have the use of only one bomb at a time for a fair few seconds, so aim your shots carefully. This is one of the more strangely nerve-wracking missions in the game, because when you consider the scale of the problem with these nanobites, it's bloody terrifying. These are computer viruses made physical on the nanoscopic level that have somehow become sentient. Good thing it's not grey goo. In the end though, Rena's mind ends up infected with this virus, and so you have to use your bombs to get the virus out of her system. It's a very tricky thing to do because you're on a time limit, but you can't aim quickly because you'll end up missing a bit. After an insight into Rena's origins as a general resource test subject, perhaps on account of her having Silverstone disease, we make our way towards the next missions, where the conflict has grown increasingly treacherous. With Sarf's commander Gabriel Park doing everything he can to escalate the war, and the increasingly odd missions you're being called upon to handle, such as using Neucom machinery to bomb general armories, leave you questioning what it is you're doing. With little in the way of options, however, you surge on. Eventually, General and Neucom reach a point of all-out war and begin fighting in the skies over major cities. During these conflicts, Rena somehow ends up piloting some especially odd machine called the Night Raven, as part of another faction called Ouroboros. Her fight doesn't last long, however. As she attempts to shoot down the carrier airship she departed from, it retaliates and shoots her down. In the end, we take down the airship ourselves, presumably killing Dijon and what was left of Ouroboros. The final battle sees us returning home to take care of the thing that saw us escalating the conflict to a point of war, Commander Park. As he's about to escape, however, he is completely exposed to us, and we assassinate him. It probably doesn't stop the war, but one belligerent is out of the game at least. After the mission is over, a cutscene plays, revealing Rena having survived the impact and leaving the unusual craft. As you and Eric fly overhead, you confirm that she is still alive. Where this goes from here? To the credits, of course. As endings go, it's a pretty straightforward one. You defeated the enemy, though it's not clear what follows on from this. Plus you get a little revenge bonus. But we're not at all close to being done with this game's storylines, so here we go with another one! Let us backtrack to the mission Paper Tiger. The two general pilots who are on the scene, Dijon and Keith Bryan, fight alongside you by taking out the rats in the sky, whilst you deal with the stuff on the waters below. Eventually, however, as Dijon attempts to convince you that the grass is greener with General Group, you decide to give it a go and follow him, despite Keith's concerns that it's a risk to take such an unproven pilot. So, you're a general employee now. Congrats on becoming a corporate busybody. Now go and kick some ass in your new craft as a Soldier of Fortune. Incidentally, the next mission is called Soldier of Fortune. Importantly, you reach the mission Tainted Peace. If this seems familiar, that's because you've played the mission Scylla and Charybdis already, where you probably left Clarkson and Fiona to die in the passenger coffin that was allegedly en route to Neucom. In this mission though, you have absolutely no choice but to eliminate Clarkson. You get the refueling thing again, and once you've done that, you are sent into the stratosphere in the mission Stratosphere. Pretty normal stuff. You have to complete one of two objectives here. Either destroy the mobberers that are trying to escape, the original objective, or assist Keith in his plight of being attacked by another pilot, which will move you onto another pair of missions. However, you eventually reach the mission Dilemma, which itself gives you a dilemma to consider. Quite apart from the fact that Dijon decided to recruit you to General, he tries to convince you to join his secret coup that would put a cat among the pigeons in the war that is about to break out. Keith is none too thrilled about this, since Dijon was as good a partner as he could have hoped for in battle, and profoundly rejects the idea of leaving General like this. And if you stuck by your guns and stayed with Keith, you'll be heading on to betrayal. Head of the Serpent follows shortly after, as you are tasked with taking down Sphyrna, which, as we know from the UPEO playthrough, is the airship that houses Dijon and his Ouroboros coup. The mission Casualties of War sees the conflict come to a head, with the final battle between us and Dijon. After enough damage has been dealt to Dijon, Keith will deliver a killing blow, but his craft's damage is too great to come back alive. Landing after the mission is complete, you tune in to see the news and discover a group of 8 aircraft heading towards the city of Port Edwards, where you are currently located. Assumed to be of Neucom manufacture, your mission is to take them down. Thus came Geopelia. They are all especially difficult to take down normally, and having 8 of them to deal with sounds like torture under any normal circumstance, especially since missiles don't seem to do much on their own. We do find ourselves flying very close to one though, and this is the first clue we get that things are not as they seem. Gameplay stops for a moment, we get a shot of the cityscape that is Port Edwards, and we find ourselves restarting the mission. But this time we are in one of these XR900s, and we're told that hacking has been completed. Why this happened I can't say right now, but suffice it to say, things are very strange. but our craft now being on equal footing with the others gives us a fighting chance. After the mission, a cutscene plays where the game and Geopelia craft we piloted land and are stored in a hangar. A news anchor reports the situation has seemingly changed and that the conflict may be over, though whose aircraft these Geopelia were, we can only assume right now. And credits for the second time. With the hacking of the Geopelia, we got our first sign that things are stranger than we might have expected. Nonetheless, we are now 40% of the way through the game, with 3 more storylines to complete, so let's have a look at Neucom. During the mission Scylla and Charybdis on the UPEO playthrough, you may recall there is a decision at the end which sees you either killing Clarkson and Fiona, or following them at the cost of your UPEO comradeship. You take the decision to follow Clarkson and Fiona over to Neucom, and once refueled, we end up in the city of Dennis. Clarkson confirms his defection to Neucom, whilst Fiona talks to us for a bit before being interrupted by her older sister Cynthia. Our first mission with Neucom involves us taking over the base at White Valley, though we have an interesting start to the mission which involves us starting in the Stratosphere. In our new and fresh Remora, we are launched to take out a few flies from upwards of 30 kilometers above ground. Also, this mission is chronologically linked to the general mission Stratosphere. How appropriate. Depending on how much stuff we destroy in the base, namely the radar sites and fuel tanks, we can end up going 2 different mission routes, so the one I'll go into is the mission Zero Gravity. Though before we begin the next mission, we get a message from a man named Simon. He seems to know who we are, and his mannerisms are very suspicious. His eyes dart around a fair bit compared to other interactions we've had in this game. Anyway, Zero Gravity. In the previous mission, we flew in the Stratosphere. In this mission, however, we aren't even in the atmosphere proper anymore, we're in space. So this is a timed mission where we have exactly 3 minutes to take out 4 satellites of general manufacture. Otherwise, explosions that we don't want will happen. It's impressive just how straight this game plays these situations, because while stuff like this is absurdly bananas in concept, it somehow works. Like, somehow it doesn't go so far off the walls into the realm of absurdity in these kinds of missions. Anyway, we take the satellites down, we re-enter the atmosphere, and we are privy to a cutscene featuring the sisters Fiona and Cynthia arguing over Fiona's discovery that Cynthia enlisted to take part in an experimental technology test, sublimation. More on that in a bit, but the upshot of it is both are upset at one another for the opposite sister's stubbornness. And at the end of the mission Utopian Dreams, we decided it would be best to not partake in Cynthia's dreams in joining Ouroboros, instead sticking with Fiona at Neucom. As the Ouroboros crew comes forth, we eventually have to go through a maze of tunnels in the mission Tunnel Vision. It's a very tricky mission as it involves navigating tight areas, as well as making it through gaps that only ever get smaller. We eventually find ourselves in an area known as the Geofront, an entire city under the earth supported by pillars. Gotta say, I sure am reminded a lot about another media franchise that also has an underground city called a Geofront. This isn't even a subtle reference. I mean, Renna is straight up following Rey's character archetype. Speaking of Renna, here she is in her Night Raven, and we have to take her down. The only problem, however, is that she is far too agile for us to take down normally. As we struggle, however, Simon, remember him, butts in and says he can momentarily power down the Geofront's Eon generators that give the Night Raven its potency. Once Simon confirms the deactivation, you have a window of 30 seconds to assault Renna's temporarily weakened Night Raven. The generators reactivate when the time has elapsed, but will deactivate again when Simon gives the warning. Loop until the Night Raven is eliminated. Enter Dijon. Well, he was there from the start, but we couldn't do anything about him because of Renna. We deal with them to end the mission, and in the cutscene that follows, Fiona, relieved but exhausted, announces her intent to leave Neucom. An animated cutscene plays shortly after. Fiona is sat in her quarters looking at a hologram of her and Cynthia. Cynthia appears on the television display in Fiona's room, however, communicating with her from beyond the grave via the sublimation. Enraged, Fiona throws the hologram module at the screen after the message ends, angrily sobbing. So, sublimation. As we saw with Dijon earlier, we can gather that the process of sublimation is where an individual's mind, memories and consciousness are copied and retained as a program on the Electrosphere, theoretically forever. In science, the term sublimation refers to a chemical process, where a substance changes its phase from solid to gas without becoming liquid in the process. It's a fairly clever way to put it, really. Your body and its experiences get turned into electronic impulses on a network, in what we'll use as an approximate example of a gas. There is also a Freudian psychological definition for the word, which refers to the defense mechanism of redirecting negative impulses and thoughts into positive and more healthy activities. For example, desiring to assault someone in a rage, but opting instead to do a spot of gardening or go for a walk. The psychological definition doesn't really fit here. This is clearly referencing the chemistry term. Cynthia is dead, but remains alive in the Electrosphere because she gave up her flesh and created a copy of herself before running into battle against us. It's a pretty dark ending in some respects. That's not to say many of the endings here are particularly rosy, but it's certainly one of the darker ones in the game. However, if you're keeping track, we still have 2 more to cover. So what happens if you follow Dijon all the way from the start? To make this relatively quick, we'll go back to the mission Dilemma in the general storyline. If you recall, we are given a choice between following Dijon and joining Ouroboros, or staying with Keith at General. For our purposes, we will follow Dijon, and head on over to Ouroboros by trying to dock with the airship Sphyrna. It's such a weird beast of a machine, and trying to dock under it is a bit of a test, but we just about manage. We're already fairly familiar with the events that happened in the first couple missions as we've experienced them in different perspectives, but with Rena as part of the team, we go ahead and bring the Mega Float, the city on the water, to a crushing collapse. Before the mission Arch Nemesis, we watch a cutscene showing us something important, the final steps in an experiment Dijon took part in. 10 years ago, in 2030, Dijon had undergone the process of sublimation, which created a copy of his mind and consciousness and put him onto the Electrosphere. However, not long after this process was completed, he and the scientist Yoko ended up eliminated by General Resource Forces, and the sublimated Dijon, forced to watch the whole event unfurl, is horrified and stricken with grief. In the mission itself, we head over to Expo City, where UPEO's commander Park lies in wait, but we kill him much like we did at the end of the UPEO playthrough. As the mission ends, however, a cutscene plays as we get a look into Rena's mind. But she soon screams in a panic, and Dijon realizes very quickly what the problem is. It's you. The following missions are about you dealing with Rena and Dijon. The mission memory error brings about a surprising twist in that Keith, horrified at what has happened at the hands of Dijon and Rena, tries to take the Night Raven down, but has his wings clipped. Undeterred, he jams his craft right between the Night Raven's own. This slows the Night Raven down substantially and gives you a chance to take it down, albeit with Keith's sacrifice along the way. An increasingly distressed Dijon aims to take you down, leading to a battle against him in the skies over Rocky Island. Deal enough damage to Dijon and he will start cursing you more and more. However, we are not remotely done with this mission because all of a sudden, we find ourselves in a bizarre dimension that we haven't set foot in before. We are now in the Electrosphere, fighting in a disorienting infinity, doing all that we can do to eliminate Dijon and wipe his entire existence out. The sheer surreality of this mission cannot be understated, as the game's visual effects give this section an incredible sense of strangeness. It's a brutal battle in an alien environment, one we eventually win. Dijon is eliminated, but before he's destroyed, he references Simon, hinting of a relationship between you and he. In the real world, however, we see a news report detailing that the downed craft didn't seem to have bodies in them despite recoveries. You're probably smelling a rat now, and given everything we know already, it's hard not to be especially suspicious at who, or perhaps more appropriately, what, we are. However, there is one more ending we must endure, and it is the one that gives us the key to understanding absolutely everything. Let us go back to the Neucom run and to the mission Utopian Dreams. Cynthia gives us an ultimatum of staying with Neucom and Fiona, or following in her footsteps and joining the experiments at Ouroboros. Much like with Dijon just a moment ago, we're convinced, and we dock onto Smyrna without a worry in our hearts. As we land, however, we get a news report that a Neucom base has been caught in an incident which sees several individuals, including Fiona, killed. We don't know what happened exactly or why, but Cynthia is mourning her sister's death, upset that Fiona didn't take the idea of sublimation seriously, lest she'd still have a presence. Nevertheless, we fight alongside Cynthia throughout the rest of the campaign, and it begins with a mission to secure Rena as the pilot for the Night Raven, giving her the wings she often talked about having. Following the mission in which you recruit Rena, discussion breaks out between Dijon and Cynthia, but by the sounds of it, Cynthia is getting buyer's remorse from going this route, and the discussion takes on the tone of a dispute. Cynthia, finding out Dijon didn't plan for the situation he found himself in, instead treading water in his sublimated form, upsets her enough that she realises this isn't what she wants, and that Fiona wasn't the stubborn one, but Cynthia herself. Cynthia discovers that Dijon is using Rena to destroy Megafloat. By the time we get there, all that remains is a smouldering heap, a ruined monument to technological excess and greed. And the beings that did it hover right above it like carrion. After destroying Dijon's craft and Smyrna, you find your way into the Geofront to take on Rena in her Night Raven. However, doing enough damage will bring the battle away from the Geofront and into the skies above the city of Port Edwards. Thus begins the final mission in the game, Self-Awareness. Rena is too fast for us to hit, and throughout the mission, she will hound us at every turn. I think this is the hardest mission in the game, and I spent most of it with only a single percentage of health remaining. But man, it's such a fun one. The Night Raven's agility can't be stopped, unless you follow Simon's instruction of taking out the city's Eon generators that dot the map. Destroy the Eon generators, and the Night Raven slows, becoming a very vulnerable bird. Before long, we clip its wings and bring it crashing down to Earth. Cynthia talks to you after the mission, thanking you for sticking with her. She asks you if there's anywhere you'd like to go to get away from the horrors of war. You don't give a vocal answer, instead opting to fly on, even as Cynthia asks for a response. In a news broadcast, General Resource, Neucom and UPEO agree to a unilateral ceasefire, as well as temporarily joining forces to quash rebellions in their camps. Simon, watching on, removes his glasses and says, Okay, what is going on here? Was he referring to us just now? Are we his son? His test subject that he referred to after we downed the Night Raven? Or are we something more than that? The answer comes just moments later for us. You see, whilst I said this game has 5 endings, that's only mostly true. The complete truth is that after completing all 5 endings in the game, you gain access to a bonus ending that appears shortly after that. It's a message from Simon, explaining exactly what is going on. You, the main character of this game, are an artificial intelligence program, and the events that took place in the game? They were a simulation of all the possible things that can happen. Just like that, we've had the rug pulled out from under us worse than 100 crypto bros. Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere really just pulled the "it was all just a dream" idea. This was a daring move from Namco, one that it pulled off in an impressive way. Allow me to explain. You remember the times during some endings where things happened without an obvious reason for them at the time? Like hacking a Geopelia to control it, or fighting Dijon within the Electrosphere itself, or reaching into the recesses of Rena's psyche? You being an AI begins to make a ton of sense now. On top of that, consider that in this game, aviation has reached a point where the limiting factor isn't the power of the craft or the aerodynamic efficiency, but the thing piloting it. The forces of acceleration in an aircraft are such that it requires tremendous physical strength to withstand, supplemented by a suit that compresses the muscles to prevent blood from being forced towards the lower extremities and away from the brain. However, even that isn't enough, and G-lock is a very real concern for pilots performing intense maneuvers. So, how about we remove the human from the equation? Let's make it so that a human doesn't have to be inside of the aircraft, and in its place, some sort of artificial intelligence system takes control of the craft. It sounds like a smart idea with a few positives, such as being able to push past the limits of what humans can withstand. However, making an AI that can act accordingly to things in the battlefield is a big undertaking. This is a part of the reason for why sublimation was a big deal in the setting, because with an experienced pilot like Dijon, all you needed was to turn him into a program and his abilities would slot right in. But eventually, we reached a point where an AI was viable. It was done by Simon Cohen, and we are his creation. Simon's entire raison d'etre after the death of Yoko was to find a way to get revenge on Dijon, with whom Yoko had a relationship, before eventually being killed along with Dijon's physical being. The kind of relationship Simon and Yoko had, we don't get many details of, but Simon's determination gave him everything he needed in order to find a way to erase Dijon. And the answer was the AI Nemo. And within a simulacrum of the real world, he tested if it was possible for Dijon to be truly eliminated. At UPEO, we destroyed Sphere to eliminate him. At General, we and Keith took him down. At Neucom, we took him down in the Geofront. In the first Ouroboros ending, we eliminated him in the Electrosphere itself. And in the second, we brought him down over the burning corpse of Megafloat. In every single one of the endings we completed, Dijon is eliminated. Satisfied with every outcome involving Dijon's demise, Simon unleashes his creation onto the world at large. By the way, Nemo? Why that name? Well, the word Nemo comes from the Latin for nobody, although it may have roots as a name in the ancient Greek word otis, of the same meaning, possibly as a reference to the Homeric poem The Odyssey. Who exactly is this Nemo? Well, he's nobody. He doesn't have a body, he doesn't have a personality, he's not even really a he either. It's a construct, an artificial intelligence designed to exact revenge on a man whom Simon believes led to Yoko's death. Nobody was piloting the coffins that took down Dijon, Renner, Park, Keith, Fiona, Clarkson. Nobody but nobody. Nobody but Nemo. And now, Nemo is free, and with Nemo's purge from the Electrosphere, the game can begin.
さあ、あらかじめ仕組まれた物語など存在しない。ゲームを始めよう。
Before we go into any sort of concluding remarks with this game, I want to say that this is the hardest game I have covered. Not in terms of the game's difficulty, necessarily. It's a challenge, but not an overwhelming one, really. No, what I'm referring to is how much of a challenge it is to talk about this game in such a way that I don't end up ruining it for people. Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere is one of the most intense games I have played in a long time. And in the 18 hours of footage I have recorded for this game, I have gone through the full gamut of emotions. I've been angry, I've been irritated, I've been annoyed when things haven't gone as I'd like. I've been sad at some character moments, I've been scared or unnerved by certain situations. But I've also had some of the most fun a game has given me in a long time. I've been excited, I've been invested, I've been thrilled, and I've come away from this game all the happier. In recent times, the only games that have scratched that kind of itch were the Marathon games by Bungie, especially Marathon Infinity and its truly insane story. I'm tempted to say that Marathon is to first-person shooters what Ace Combat is to arcade flight sims. It pushed the bounds in ways that are especially influential to this day. Writing this review, I kept wondering what direction I wanted to go with it. If I wanted to get the review out and have done with it, I would have released this review a week earlier than I eventually did. However, I wanted to take my time with it. I wanted this to be a review that did Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere justice, and I hope I've accomplished that. This is as deep a dive as I've done with any game I have covered so far, and I had a grand old time doing it. And with that, I think it's time that we went ahead and moved on to the conclusion, because I'm bloody exhausted. These reviews have been a ton of fun, and I have come away from them with a new series that I am properly into now. The original Ace Combat was a fun, arcade-style game, whilst Ace Combat 2 sought to improve on the original in every single aspect. Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, however, was a game changer in a comedically literal sense of the word. Namco introduced a story that was properly engaging and fun to play through, and even with the language barrier in place, I actively sought out ways to jump the hurdles that it presented. And this is before saying anything with regards to the rest of the game. Its audio is greatly improved, the music is fantastic, the visuals are among the best the PlayStation has ever conjured. On top of having rock solid performance, the gameplay is taut and well refined, and it is easily among my favourite PlayStation games ever. Pretty much the only gripes I have with this game are minor visual quirks like the occasional row of pixels being offset at the bottom, and that this game was so horrifically and tragically butchered for its release in the West. For importability and language requirements, this game, like the previous two, is pretty easy to get a hold of from Japan for a decent enough price. Depending on where you look, it's possible to get all three games for under 1,000 yen or about $7. Its relatively standalone nature makes it work as a game to just start the series with if you want it. Language requirements are a little harder to sit down with, however. It's possible to play this game without caring too much about the story, but your experience isn't going to be optimal, because this is a game that is elevated and augmented by its story, and losing that bit of context can impact your enjoyment of the game. I played with the use of transcripts that I would read alongside the game's dialogue, and got on well enough for the most part, although the transcripts were not the most reliable. This wouldn't have been much of a problem if the game had actually had an official release in the West with all of the content properly translated. Anyway, I should move on to the Ace Combat series' legacy, because I don't know if I'm going to review any of the other games in the series. Although I am not going to discount the possibility at all. We'll see, just not right now. In 2001, the series would receive its first entry on the PlayStation 2, called Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies. For a time, it was the most successful entry in the series, having sold 2.64 million units over its lifespan, as well as being one of the series' most well-reviewed and well-regarded entries. 2004 would be met with Ace Combat 5 The Unsung War, a game that was praised at the time for its graphics, and whilst its general similarities to Shattered Skies were noted, it didn't detract too much from the game as a whole, despite slightly cooler but still positive reviews overall. The Unsung War got a prequel of sorts in 2006 called Ace Combat 0 The Balkan War, and whilst reception was cooler still, it was still positive on the whole, although the incremental changes were only helping so much at this point. It was also at this point that Namco had folded. Their financial troubles caught up with them, and they were absorbed into Bandai in order to survive, hence why the game was among the first to be published under Namco Bandai Games in the West. The PlayStation Portable would get its first series entry with Ace Combat X Skies of Deception that same year. It reviewed quite well as an entry for a console that was in some slight need of love and attention. The next mainline entry came in 2007, but not on a Sony system. Ace Combat 6 Fires of Liberation was released exclusively for Microsoft's Xbox 360. Namco went in quite hard on the Xbox 360 early on, and despite the positive reviews, it's currently the worst selling entry in the series, with only 700 units sold as of 2012. As far as Namco were concerned, change was necessary, and in 2011 it elected to reboot the Ace Combat series with the most maligned entry in the series, Ace Combat Assault Horizon. It sold over 1 million units, but have fun trying to buy it today. And even then, Ace Combat fans will generally tell you not to bother. The most recent entry in the series released in 2019, Ace Combat 7 Skies Unknown. As of November 2022, it has sold in excess of 4 million units, making it by far and away the most popular title in the franchise, helped in no small part by the praise it got by fans of the franchise, hailing it as a return to form. It also has a VR mode. In 2021, there was some flavour of confirmation that Ace Combat was to get another entry, but at the time of this review, no further details have been forthcoming. Personally, I reckon that we may hear something later on this year about it. In the meantime, we've got a wealth of stuff to play. There are even games that released in the wake of the Ace Combat franchise as a whole, and whilst I haven't played many of them, I know of people who have, and by and large, they love some of them. As an example, Project Wingman released in 2020 for PC and in 2021 for the Xbox One, and takes its cues rather extensively from Ace Combat. It really does look and seem like a love letter to the series that made these kinds of games viable. Ace Combat paved the way for a great number of arcade-style combat flight simulators, whilst also giving the games more of a refined simulated edge. They were improved in ways that made sense, and even when the improvements were sparse, the games were still generally fun to play. Other Namco franchises from the 1990s may have fallen by the wayside, as seems to be the case for Ridge Racer, but Ace Combat remains as one of the few exceptions in Namco's catalogue to still be putting out really good games. The first Ace Combat introduced a concept to the PlayStation. Ace Combat 2 refined it in a way to make it better as a game and solidify it as a concept. The third game, Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, went ahead and blew the doors off it, started anew, and came back with a genuinely legendary game. I cannot recommend it enough, and that is what I've spent roughly an hour trying to do. If you have any recommendations for what I ought to cover, please let me know. I'm open to pretty much anything. In the description is my Twitter to keep up to date with everything that I'm up to, as well as my Instagram for when I can be bothered to post on there. My website isn't available at the moment. I'm still trying to muster up the energy to work on that. It will come back eventually, however. As ever though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Sidhi.